You stand at the sink, watching soap bubbles drift and pop, and the question returns in the middle of an ordinary task. Not as a slogan, but as a pressure behind the day, asking whether life has a structure deeper than schedules and explanations. If meaning exists, it rarely arrives as an answer. It comes as a pattern that repeats until we are forced to notice it. What lies behind the hidden harmony of the cosmos and the silent echoes of the ancient world that still surrounds us? Do we inhabit a world of shadows, or do we participate in a more profound architecture that quietly shapes what we call reality? How does the modern mind bridge measurable physics with the felt reality of spirit without collapsing one into the other? Giordano Bruno imagined an infinite universe where every star is a sun and worlds are many, and infinity becomes a discipline of humility. He did not present this as comfort, but as an expansion that removes the center from our private dramas. In a finite cosmos, meaning can be managed, parceled, and domesticated. In an infinite cosmos, meaning becomes an ethic of attention, because the mind must learn to hold the ungraspable without panic. Bruno also paid a price for refusing the safety of approved boundaries, and that fact matters more than the romance around his name. His courage is not an argument for any doctrine, but a reminder that ideas reshape the soul when they are taken seriously. Paracelsus insisted that a physician must read correspondences between body, psyche, and sky, as if each person carried a private astronomy. He attacked the medical practices of his era, not as rebellion for its own sake, but as a demand for direct observation in place of inherited authority. When he spoke of stars within, he was not asking for astrology as entertainment, but for a model of hidden influences and internal weather. He treated symptoms as signals, not merely as errors to suppress, and he assumed that the soul has its own physiology. Plotinus inverted the problem of identity, holding that the soul is not in the body, but that the body appears within the vastness of the soul. In his framework, the world is not an object we stand outside of, but an emanation we participate in. The task is not to accumulate more objects of thought, but to refine the instrument that thinks. This is why the ancient language feels unfamiliar now. It prioritizes discipline over explanation. Wolfgang Pauli, an architect of quantum principles, studied dreams and symbols in dialogue with Carl Jung, testing whether mind and matter share a hidden grammar. Pauli's question was not whether myths are true, but whether psyche produces forms with the same stubborn regularity we see in nature. He lived inside equations that predicted reality, and he also lived inside images that predicted emotion. That collision is not poetic, it is operational, because a person cannot think clearly when their inner world is in chaos. When an image repeats in dreams, he treated it like data, something to be handled carefully rather than worshipped or dismissed. He observed how symbols cluster, how they change under stress, and how they return when the mind tries to forget them. He did not call this proof of the supernatural. He treated it as evidence that the psyche has structure. And if psyche has structure, it may have laws, even if they are not measured in the same units as mass and velocity. In the illuminated pages of the Splendor Solis, purification is staged as a sequence of operations, symbolic yet precise in what they demand from attention. The images do not promise comfort. They describe a transformation that is earned through repetition, constraint, and a willingness to be changed by what we observe. A king enters water, a sun rises behind sealed vessels, a creature is divided and recomposed, and the viewer is forced to slow down. The pace is part of the teaching. because a rushing mind will only project its fantasies onto the page. Alchemy, at its best, is less about substances than about the ethics of transformation. It asks what must be burned away, what must be separated, and what must be recombined under a higher order. The language is metaphorical, but it is not loose because the sequence matters. You cannot skip dissolution and claim you reached integration. You cannot demand a crown without the work that makes a crown bearable. This is why the symbols survive, because they encode a process that human beings still experience, even when we rename it. Newton filled notebooks with alchemical and theological work alongside mechanics and mathematics, and the archive shows a mind refusing a single vocabulary for reality. Some passages read like code, not because they are theatrical, but because they are technical in another register that modern training rarely teaches us to read. He copied recipes, compared sources, tracked variations, and argued with invisible opponents across the margins of his pages. He treated ancient texts like encrypted reports from earlier laboratories, and he assumed that the world had deeper layers than public science could admit. None of this diminishes his physics, and none of it proves modern fantasies about him. It simply reveals a mind with a broader bandwidth than the sanitized myths we were given in school. These seekers treated the macrocosm and the microcosm as mirrors, not slogans, and they asked what the heavens reveal about the inner instrument of perception. They were not chasing escape from reality. They were pursuing a reality more complete than that available to a purely mechanical description. The transition from alchemy to chemistry gave us repeatability, industry, and immense power, but it narrowed the question from meaning to measurement. It removed the soul from the laboratory, not because the soul was disproved, but because the soul could not be standardized. What can be weighed, sold, and reproduced becomes the language of institutions. What can only be lived becomes private and then, slowly, suspicious. The price of precision is often amnesia, because precision forces us to discard what we cannot yet quantify. In that process of discarding, we gained tools and lost a vocabulary for interior change that does not fit into spreadsheets. This is why the modern person is overinformed and under-oriented. We can explain mechanisms, yet remain ignorant of why our own lives feel fractured. Modern neuroscience maps neural correlates with stunning accuracy, yet the observer, the one who experiences, remains difficult to define in a clean equation. A scan can show activity, but it cannot easily explain why a thought feels intimate, or why a memory can wound like a physical blow. We can describe the circuitry of fear and desire, and still not address the fact of awareness, the stubborn and straightforward presence behind experience. Even the best models of perception often stop at correlation, because correlation is where instruments are strong. But meaning is not only correlation, it is valuation, and valuation is lived from within. This is the old problem in a modern guise, because it is the same question Plotinus was addressing. What is the relation between the field of experience and the objects that appear within it? Older traditions did not compete with science. They worked on orientation, on how attention is trained, and on what the mind does in silence. They treated the self as an instrument that can be tuned, distorted, or repaired. They assumed that the quality of perception changes what is perceived, which is an uncomfortable claim for a culture addicted to external fixes. Look at your home at dawn before the day starts demanding performance, and watch how light moves across a wall as shadow redraws the room's geometry. Notice what your mind does in response without correcting it, and write the first interpretation that appears, then write the second, then the third. The first is usually habit. The second is often observation. And the third sometimes hints at something you did not know you were protecting. Then write one more line that begins with a quiet confession, not a theory. Write what you avoid thinking when the day is loud, and what returns when the day is silent. Silence is not a lifestyle. It is an instrument that reveals what the noise was covering. If symbols matter, they matter the way maps matter. Not because a map is the territory, but because it trains where you look and what you ignore. A symbol compresses an experience too complex for a single sentence, and compression is how the psyche stores power. This is why symbols irritate rational minds, because they refuse to be reduced without losing their core. Manly P. Hall argued that symbols of antiquity were designed to awaken latent faculties. We need not accept every claim to test the practice. The test is simple and strict. Does the symbol change your perception, and does that change endure under pressure? In public archives, manuscripts and engravings survive that once served as inner instruments, assuming the reader will practice, not merely agree. They are crude by modern standards, yet direct in their demand for patience, because they speak to patterns that do not yield to speed. A serious symbol does not flatter you, it confronts your laziness. It exposes where you repeat yourself, where you lie to yourself, and where you outsource responsibility for your own inner state. And this is why shallow spirituality is always loud, because it must drown out the discomfort of real observation. Mathematics can feel like a scripture, not of belief but of constraint, as ratios, spirals, and orbits recur across scales, as if reality prefers specific solutions. Constraint is not oppression, it is form, and form is what allows anything to persist. A melody survives because it has structure, not because it is random. A character survives because it has consistent motives, not because it is limitless. Some physicists and philosophers argue that information may be fundamental to our modeling of the universe, and even if that claim is revised, it undermines simple materialism. It suggests that the world is not merely stuff, but organized difference, patterned relations, and stable transformations. If that is even partly true, then the inner world deserves the same seriousness we give the outer one, because the inner world is also pattern, relation, and transformation. It also destabilizes the idea that the mind is merely a private story, because beneath our names and roles, there is a current of consciousness older than biography. We drift through days like sleepwalkers when we never interrupt the stream, and the interruption is silence chosen deliberately, not as escape, but as a test. Keep a record of your dreams for 30 days without interpretation in the first week. Then, record coincidences that feel charged with meaning, and note the emotion they carry. Do not chase explanations. Track repetitions. Treat attention like an instrument. Calibrate it through documentation, and ask what inner posture each pattern demands. Over time, you will see which patterns tighten you and which patterns release you, and that distinction is more valuable than any theory. You will also see the difference between a fantasy that excites you and a truth that steadies you. From Neoplatonists to Hermetic writers, the aim was reintegration of a fragmented self into a unified whole, not through shortcuts, but through restraint and honest study. Start with the smallest experiment. 1 minute of silence, 1 page of notes, 1 exact description, and return to the sink to see whether the bubbles look the same. If they look the same, ask whether you look the same. If you look the same, repeat the experiment until you do not.